Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Meindl, and I'm a psychologist and a psychoanalyst in Montreal, Canada. Having approached my practice in a Jungian way, I've often worked with people's dreams and their fantasies. And today I'm going to tilt that focus on fantasy and imagination towards sexual dreams and talk about what we can learn from examining them rather than treating them as something embarrassing or immoral and trying to get them out of our minds. And I think most of us have had sexual dreams at one time or another. But I feel that they're not always sufficiently addressed when Jungians talk about dream interpretation because people still find them a little embarrassing. Just a disclaimer, dreams, especially sexual dreams, are very, very private things. And as a therapist, I am respectful of that. So I'm just letting you know that the dream examples that I'm using in this lecture are mostly from published sources or they are being used with the permission of the daydreamer. So let me just start. Dreams, especially sexual dreams, are an interesting subject. And those of us who are interested in dreams and depth psychology ideas sometimes feel a little marginal in our interest in dream symbolization. Yet it's amazing how thoroughly Freud's ideas about the hidden meaning of dream images has permeated our culture. For example, consider his famous suggestion that a cigar is a phallic symbol. Scrolling through Google images of people smoking cigars, it was actually hard to find one that wasn't ironically using the cigar to represent a penis or maleness, either to exaggerate that masculinity in a man or to add that quality to a woman, or to depict a phallic object entering an orifice. And this symbolic language is pretty much part of the repertoire of most educated people these days. And while Freud and Jung and their contemporaries didn't discover the symbolic meaning of dreams, because that's ancient knowledge, they brought the idea that dreams were helpful, healing, and meaningful into the modern psychological world of practice. And now, Freud, as we know, was famously preoccupied with the idea that our thoughts and feelings emerged from elementary biological drives to eat, to defend ourselves, and very importantly, to reproduce, and that these needs would appear in our dreams and our fantasies. Simplifying Freud's position in this way risks doing him an injustice. He was a complex thinker about society and religion. And if you dive into his writing far enough, you'll see that at one time or another, he considered most of the same spiritual questions that Jung explored. But because of his wish to make his theory scientific and to make it coherent with the new thoughts on human evolution that were just starting up in his time, his central emphasis was different. And eventually, when Jung diverged from his thinking in ways that neither of them could really tolerate, it drove them apart. And one of the unacceptable differences for Freud was Jung's reluctance to reduce all human experience to variations of the need to reproduce. And this difference was clear as well in their attitudes towards dream interpretation. While both of them believed that dreams represented the concerns of the dreamer, Freud's vision centered on disguised symbols that represented wishes, aggression, and sexuality. In brief, what Freud believed was that the manifest content, the actual images and storyline that we saw in the dream, were a cover up for lustful, aggressive thoughts that would disturb the dreamer if they became aware of them. And then his theory continued that the sexual drives were then disguised by what he called the dream censor to prevent this anxiety from waking the dreamer up. And the fact that people, even in his repressed era, still had manifestly erotic dreams, despite the efforts of the dream censor, may have been a bit of a conundrum for his theory. But Freud looked under the manifest images and he focused on a relatively limited number of sexual scenes. From a Freudian perspective, any upright cylindrical object or roundish containing feature could represent male or female genitals, and many ordinary objects could stand in for them. Georgia O'Keeffe was famous herself for playing with that idea in a sexual floral intersection. And here, you can see another very phallic image, drawn from nature. For Freud, shoes and handbags were what he would call containing objects into which other objects were inserted and withdrawn. And if you push this idea a little further, the shoe fetishes that we hear about, not the people who collect shoes a la Imelda Marcos, but the people who get sexually turned on by shoes, shoe fetishes are really just an intensification of this tendency where the sexual impulse has been turned away from a human object and turned towards a physical object that represents the sexual object, but can be controlled by the fetishist. Some other examples of sexual stand-ins from psychoanalysis might be, for example, a client whose sexual life with his wife was at a standstill, who reported a dream of driving a train underneath an arch and through a tunnel, and then emerging on the other side with a blissful feeling of triumph. The symbolism is pretty obvious from a Freudian perspective. Another example from Freud's early work with his patient Dora, she had a small handbag, a reticule, that she kept on her lap that she would play with during her sessions. And he described this as being symbolic of her genitals, and her playing with it was a representation of her secret and shameful masturbation. But a modern woman who was in analysis made a very poignant link while describing how she shops for handbags when she's upset. She makes her own excellent interpretation, and she said, "The bag should be just right, not too big. It'll look absurd, just as my emotions and my lust and my need are too big." Now, I think that very few handbag collecting women would really be capable of making that link. But what they do know is that when they're upset and they shop for handbags, it gives them some sort of a good feeling that makes them want to do it some more. Now, Jung took a broader view of dreams than Freud did. Particularly, he felt that dreams weren't trying to hide things, but that they were trying to communicate something to consciousness. And he suggested that dreams had four functions: to compensate the position or the attitude of consciousness, to reveal the actual situation of the unconscious at the time, to carry a message from the unconscious to consciousness, or to personify the psychological complexes that were active at the time. So Jung's spiritual and individualistic approach to dream imagery is probably rooted in his own personal experience of dreams. If any of you were with me for that lecture I gave here on fantasy and daydreaming, you may remember that Jung's family, especially on his mother's side, was particularly quirky, and there was a lot of lucid dreaming and esoteric spiritual activity in many of his family members. So he certainly came by his interest and his ability to evoke dreams and fantasies honestly, as you would say. And it started young. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung reports the earliest dream that he could remember. And he placed it, he thinks, between the ages of 3 and 4. And it contained what we now know is a sexual image that he probably didn't understand as a child, but only sort of got later as when he was an adult. And I'm not going to read the whole dream to you because you're probably, most of you, somewhat familiar with it because it's often cited in the Jungian literature. But he in his dream, he found a hole in the backyard and he went down into it, and there he found a platform with a wonderfully rich golden throne. I'm not certain, but uh, perhaps a red cushion. It was a magnificent throne, a real king's throne in a fairy tale. Something was standing on it, which I thought at first was a tree trunk, 12 to 15 feet high and about 1.5 to 2 feet thick. It was a huge thing, reaching almost to the ceiling, but it was of a curious composition. It was made of skin and naked flesh, and on top there was something like a rounded head with no face and no hair. And on the very top of the head was a single eye gazing motionlessly upward. It was fairly light in the room, although there were no windows and no apparent source of light. Above the head, however, was an aura of brightness. The thing did not move, yet I had the feeling that it might at any moment crawl off the throne like a worm and creep towards me. I was paralyzed with terror. Now, from a Freudian angle, this dream is very much a penis in a hole, only obscured by a child's sexual naivete. But 4-year-old Jung's reaction was awe and respect, an attitude that he maintained towards dream imagery, sexual and otherwise, as he matured. And as he said, it was a dream which was to preoccupy me all my life. And he's not alone in this awestruck response. In many times and places, the sexual objects have been worshipped as symbols of generativity. For example, the lingam and the yoni in India, which are the abstracted male and female sexual organs, particularly a stylized penis. And to illustrate how natural and intuitive it is to see the world in symbolic sexual representations, here's another example of a Shiva lingam that's been honored by strewing it with flowers. And this time it's a naturally occurring column of water that's being venerated. This ability that we have to translate between ideas and images comes easily and naturally to most of us. It's simply part of how we think. We intuitively select representative objects like the ice lingam, or we apply the socially taught ones, like our modern tendency to see cigars as sexually suggestive. But on a lighter note, personally, I remember once walking into a business meeting and seeing 3 youngish men with shaved heads sitting in a row. And seeing them from the back, I was struck by the phallic image that they were perhaps unintentionally presenting as they tried to deal with their receding hairlines. Were they consciously signifying masculine potency to compensate from their fear of losing their masculine attractiveness with their hair? Or was it just that since I had dealt with them before, I was just projecting how I unconsciously expected them to behave? But I have to admit that the word dickhead floated into my mind. Okay, so we're naturally good at noticing physical similarities and making links. But if we're thinking like Jungians, the symbols are going to go deeper than just associations, right down to an archetypal level. And we can wonder, reasonably, how these links came to be created in the archetypal depths. Now, Erich Neumann, a famous Jungian thinker, has some suggestions about this. For example, about the representation of the masculine and feminine, like in the lingam and the yoni. And he says the differentiation of man and woman is the earliest and most impressive projection of opposites. For this reason, every archetypal opposition easily assumes the symbolism of the masculine and feminine, and hence the opposition of conscious and unconscious is experienced in terms of this symbol, the masculine identified with consciousness and the feminine with the unconscious. And beyond the opposition of male and female, which, as Eric Neumann suggests, is a very kind of evident opposition. If any relationship between human experiences could establish inherited archetypal images in our mind, it would be other areas that are as vital to human survival as the masculine and the feminine connection. And the two areas of human life that are the greatest importance to human survival are obviously sex and food production. And so these seem to be likely types of relationship for the unconscious to generate archetypal images of. And indeed, anthropologists who study what they call agricultural procreational parallelism, agricultural procreational parallelism, notice the intersection between early agricultural and sexual beliefs and how the two spheres overlapped in early people's minds so that in magical practices, one could be substituted for the other. For example, that human intercourse became important in ensuring the fertility of the fields. In some cultures, the plow had a male symbolism because plowing was considered men's work and also because it entered the earth like that. And even today, husbandry is the word that we use for the cultivation or the production of plants or animals. We consider the earth female because of its ability to bring forth living things. We still talk about Mother Earth, and earth mothers are a type of female personality. You may have heard, as I have somewhere in my anthropology classes, that in some ancient cultures, farmers would abstain from having sex around the plowing and seeding times so that their own personal potency could be magically transferred to the planting instead. So then we had customs like the farmer and his wife having sex in the field in order to ensure a good harvest. So here's another example. Here are photos of a Bulgarian cave that was used in fertility rituals. And the early inhabitants of the region apparently altered the natural shapes a bit to make the resemblance more clear. But when the elongated shaft of light from above touched the abstracted female organ over here, you can see the penis shape and then the vulva shape. It was time for the ceremony to ensure the fertility of the crops. So, sexual imagery may track with our relationship to the natural world, but sex isn't just a simple biological act for human beings. It's also a very relational act. And Jung could be considered one of the first relational analysts who proposed that our psyches react to one another in what is now called a two-person psychology. And this is now the standard in most of modern psychology, and things like attachment theory are based on the idea that human beings are born relational and seek relationship. So, as a result, Jung thought deeply about how images in dreams and fantasies were able to represent both inner and interpersonal dynamics. I've always loved the Jung quote where he said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the meeting of two chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both are changed." Now, admittedly, that's a concept from chemistry rather than biology, but it's still a metaphorical link to a natural process. Jung was also more concerned than Freud with the spiritual aspects of human life, and he argued that dreams spoke about things far more varied than just instinctual processes and aggression. So in this presentation, which is a Jungian presentation, we're going to think about the interpretation of sexual material in two directions, interpreting from non-sexual images towards sexuality, a la Freud, or interpreting from sexual images towards psychological meaning. So we can call that interpreting towards sex or interpreting away from it, because sometimes it's necessary to look at dream material, which is not obviously sexual, to see how it expresses important unrecognized sexual tensions. And in the other direction, sometimes explicitly sexual dream material has important relational or psychological meaning. And the value of this two-way approach is that it allows us to do what I think that the unconscious wants us to do with dreams anyway, which is to link one domain of experience with another, using metaphor as a bridge to connect relational issues to sexual ones and vice versa. Now, it's still true in a Freudian way that some dreams speak of sexuality in a disguised or perhaps more accurately metaphoric language. And our ability to symbolize facilitates this representation of one thing by another, as I've been saying. And the instinctual potency of the sexual relationship gives it the power to carry a lot of other significant meanings. As Freud pointed out, many objects, spaces, and places can be suggestive of sexual experience or desire, or talk about different aspects of sexual development, and not to forget its generative outcome, including gestation and birth. Consider these artists' representations of people in womb-like settings. It can even be alluded to as an element of design. A womb chair reminds us that a seemingly innocuous, or in this case, rather disturbing, image of a person curled in a chair can have significant importance as an image of gestation. I mean, the man is actually sucking his thumb like a baby, right? But if you had a dream of somebody curled up naked in a chair, would you necessarily think of it as representing a womb? Not unless you did some thinking around it. Now here's a non-sexual dream that contained significant sexual and specifically gestational imagery. There was a young woman who was starting training to become a pastor, and she dreamed of entering the seminary for the first time. She had to come in from the sidewalk, go past a security guard at the door. Inside, she met a receptionist who waved her to go down a curving corridor, which led her into a round room with a very soft, deep red carpet and walls and a floor that bounced underneath her feet. And in the center of this room was a wise old man in a roughly woven but beautifully textured red suit who warmly welcomed her. Now, this dream, if you think about it in terms of gestational imagery, represents a symbolic movement, first past the guardian at the gate, which perhaps represented the doubts and fears she had about entering her training. And then she's waved along by a more supportive feminine figure up a vaginal corridor to a rather obviously womb-like room, which we could say represented her hopes for a warm reception and a place for her spiritual development during her training. The sexual human body of a parent, of our beloved, or of a frightening other can also be represented by landscape, either in the foreground or the background. Landscapes can be used as sexual images, but how many of us bother to look for them in the landscapes in our dreams and fantasies? But the dreams the landscape's character, is it a fertile, is it desolate, is it icy and snowy? These things may indicate the dreamer's attitudes and feelings about their sexual and emotional state, opportunities, or potential. One example of a sexual image hidden in a landscape, well, not very well hidden in this picture, might be these more or less obviously breast-shaped mountains in the background. But there could be less obvious ones where bodies and landscapes are much harder to tell apart. For example, these, it's hard to tell which is the body and which is the landscape, isn't it? Or this one. And sources of symbolic inspiration may differ as well. People who have a nurtured or nurturing relationship to the land may use landscapes as sexually representative, but city dwellers might use urban landscapes of buildings and tunnels as a source of symbolic images. One dreamer reported repetitive dreams of heroically rescuing people, and a consistent feature in many of the dreams was a tall central building flanked by two lower wings, a kind of blatantly sexually symbolic image of phallic power holding others captive, we could say. And sexuality can also be represented in a dream by rhythm, by rising and falling waves, galloping horses, or in the case of geysers, pressure building up and being released. But when the symbolism isn't obvious, or you don't know about the sexual situation involved, for example, if you were a therapist, how do you know if a cigar is more than just a cigar? Well, you discover it in the associative process that follows either the telling of the dream or the reflection on the dream if you're exploring your associations alone. Now, in his book on dreams, Jung suggested there are two main perspectives for interpreting dreams: causality, which is often associated with Freud, and finality, which was Jung's preferred perspective. Sometimes people who are uninterested in understanding their dreams just attribute their cause to something like a bad meal or a physical need. For example, the need to pee at night will bring up a dream of running water as the dream tries to communicate something practical to consciousness. Or you could think of that moment in A Christmas Carol where the ghost of Jacob Marley confronts Scrooge, who protests that the ghost may be, in actuality, an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, or a crumb of cheese. Now, ironically, just after I had written off food as a cause of dreams for the purposes of this presentation, a scientific article came across my desk talking about the food distress theory of nightmare production. The food distress theory of nightmare production. And they were arguing that the gastric discomfort of people with food sensitivities, like lactose intolerant, might be represented in nightmares. So I guess we shouldn't dismiss it entirely. I was playing with this idea, and I thought that a lactose intolerant person might dream something like this to metaphorically capture their discomfort. So I made up this dream. They're in their childhood home when a strange rumbling begins beneath the floorboards. The walls start to gently swell and contract, almost as if the house is breathing. The dreamer tries to get out, but the hallways seem to twist and turn, and they begin to feel more and more desperate. But to get back to my real subject, Freud tended towards the causal perspective based on his idea that dreams stem from the representation of an instinctual drive or a wish. The causal view also focuses on day residue. So that suggests that ideas and images and experiences from the past day that were only processed subliminally still hold a tension that may need to be worked over and expressed in the dream. In the Freudian perspective, which tends to look for disguised instincts and wishes, many different dream images can stand in for sexual acts, such as driving a fence post into the ground, driving a train into a tunnel, as I said, or picking apples, as you'll see in a minute. They might all have the same sexual meaning. But Jung, taking what he called a final perspective in interpreting a dream, looks less for disguised symbols of instinctual needs or frustrated wishes, and he asks instead, what is the purpose of this dream? What effect is this dream meant to have? Basically, what is this dream trying to tell me? And by the way, for Jung, this question applies to every psychic activity: dreams, fantasies, Parapraxes are things like slips of the tongue, hesitations, lapses of memory. And the question applies to every psychic activity because he believed that the unconscious was purposive, that it had what Jungians call a prospective function, an ability to anticipate things or offer insight for personal development. Both Jung and Freud believed in the value of associations for understanding dreams. Jung even proposed that theoretically, the entire content of a person's life experience might be found in any dream if the associations were followed out far enough. I personally find this a very intriguing idea. However, for practical purposes, he felt that only enough material had to be gathered in order to create an interpretation that increased understanding. So, to illustrate the difference between causal and final interpretations, Jung analyzes a young man's very simple dream. The dream was, I was standing in a strange garden and picked an apple from a tree. I looked about cautiously to make sure no one saw me. And then Jung allows the young man's associations to guide his understanding. He doesn't want to impose his own symbolic meaning on the dream. He trusts his unconscious to make the right links. Because, as he put it, when the meaning is found through the patient's associations, then the material that's collected lies outside the choice of the analyst because the patient themselves is intuitively making guiding connections. So, what were the young man's associations? He remembered stealing pears as a child. The thought of a bad conscience in particular reminded him of an odd moment the day previous when he was having a chat with a young woman of his acquaintance in the street and how he felt strangely ashamed as an older man passed by as if he was doing something wrong. Now, this might be, for example, an example of day residue, right? Something that happened during the day, there was an emotion attached to it, but it wasn't properly processed. He also associated picking apples with Adam and Eve, the Bible story in the garden, and how he never understood as a child why they were so harshly punished for eating forbidden fruit, and how he always felt that it was kind of an unjust act by God because they were just following the lead of the snake and their own natural curiosity. And then the idea of natural curiosity also reminded him of the worst punishment he ever received from his father, which he got for sneakily, secretly watching some girls bathing. And this then led to his admission that he'd started a flirtation with a neighboring housemaid, reaching what in my teens we would have called second base, which was that he got his hands on her breasts underneath her blouse. And uh, his wish to go further than that with her sexually. And Jung saw that when these interpretations were all put together, the childhood memory of stealing apples, the feeling of bad conscience while talking to the lady friend when an older man passed by, which linked to an unjust God, the fall of man, and the moment of sexual curiosity, watching the girls bathing, for which he was so severely punished, Jung could see that these associations were all linked by a feeling of guilt, making the relatively innocuous dream of surreptitiously picking apples, which in and of itself is a misdemeanor for which one could feel guilty, but made it interpretable from a causal perspective as relating to dangerous erotic wishes, which evoked anxiety about punishment. But then, while not denying the dream's representation of an instinctual wish, Jung suggested a different interpretation of the associative material, where the facts remain the same, but the perspective or the aim of the dream is different. And he focused on the idea of conscience rather than guilt or punishment. Now, conscience and guilt and punishment are related ideas, but they're differentiated by an inner or an outer locus. Guilt and punishment have got to do with the reaction of the outer world to us, whereas conscience has more to do with the reaction of the inner world. Jung felt that in his sexual excitement about the flirtation with the young woman, the man was preoccupied with achieving his sexual desire, but he wasn't considering the morality of his behavior. Um, Jung noted that, judged by the standards of the young man's outer world, his conscious idea was that his desire and his actions were perfectly normal. All his friends were doing similar things, and he couldn't see why he shouldn't either. But writing about this dream, Jung reflected on whether the idea of morality, which is something that has been worked out and handed down by human beings through the ages, had been created for a reason, whether it was a meaningful thing. And he argued that mankind must have had strong outer reasons for devising morality to restrain strong drives like aggression and sexual desire, believing that having a moral structure served the species. And Jung argued that between the associations and the impending moral mischief with the housemaid, which would have certainly have ended badly for her, the guilt felt in the young man's dream was his unconscious's way of showing him that he needed to open his eyes as an ethical being, rather than being thoughtlessly influenced by friends into an ethically questionable behavior. Now, to be clear, Jung doesn't propose that the unconscious is some sort of a moral watchdog. He doesn't claim that it's the unconscious's job to orient us towards ethical behavior. He really sees the unconscious as having a compensating and internally regulating role. The unconscious is simply the unknown, the things that are unrecognized in ourselves that need to be reckoned with when they emerge. And he argued, for example, that even people whose actions are usually very morally correct might still have dreams expressing things that seem immoral if the unconscious felt a need for rebalancing. But we may ask, what use is this unconscious communication, this unconscious effort to balance, if the dreamer doesn't understand the dream? Well, Jung points out that understanding is not exclusively an intellectual process. For the young man, his moral discomfort also snuck into his waking consciousness during his street conversation with the young woman acquaintance, as his unconscious tried in various ways to highlight the ethical question. So, from a compensating position, the young man's dream has the aim of leading him into thoughts about the need to exercise good judgment and discernment, rather than merely avoiding being caught doing something inappropriate. The young man's unbalancedness, his one sidedness, was that he was overlooking his own moral standards. And this is what the dream and its chain of associations tried to correct by highlighting and focusing on the guilt that he would feel. Jung felt that the young man needed to open his eyes as an ethical being and engage with his own internal ethical standards. So, from a final standpoint, the apple dream is trying to get him to look at the reality of his guilty feelings, not trying to hide something from him to prevent him from feeling guilt, but trying to help him be more thoughtful in his actions. Jungians who work with dreams often speak about the specificity of the image, the idea that the images that the unconscious chooses are not simply interchangeable. From the standpoint of finality or purpose, Jung felt every image in a dream was included for a reason. From an instinctual sexuality, Freudian causal perspective, the young man could have dreamed of crawling into a mine tunnel, or putting his hand into his girlfriend's purse, or putting a hot dog into a bun. And they all would be sexual wishes disguised, and they would all have the same meaning. I really want to put my oblong object into your containing object. But from the standpoint of finality or purpose, images in a dream each have an intrinsic value. If the young man had dreamed, for example, of putting his hand in the housemaid's purse, the associations might have had a different pattern, leading to a different conclusion, shedding light on the conscious situation differently than the apple scene association. So, to create an imaginary example, imagine that he did reach into her purse, and finding the purse empty might have reminded him of their financial disparity and how the little treats and gifts that he had been buying for her were putting her into a sort of debt to him that he hoped she would repay sexually. And by the way, have any of you noticed in reality how reluctant many men are to put their hand into their wife or girlfriend's purse? Like, what's going on there unconsciously? Now, the apple dream was an example from Jung's own time, but I have a more modern one. This is an example of another non-sexual dream that comes to be interpreted as being about sex. And it's very simple again. A young woman dreams she's in a laundromat loading a dryer, and her little dog keeps trying to jump in, and she, annoyed by his insistence, forbids him. Now, can you think of anything less sexy than doing laundry? But listen what happens as soon as she starts to associate. She said that she loved her little dog and she liked to cuddle him, but sometimes when he jumped up joyfully, his paws were wet and she didn't like being made dirty. And her therapist asked her if this made her think of any other life situation. And she quickly recognized that she'd recently started dating a man who was putting pressure on her for sex. And in this dream, her little dog represented her date's insistent and enthusiastic sexual desire, and her response of feeling pawed and dirty by it. And visually, the round opening of the dryer with the damp folds of cloth inside it is a pretty good Freudian representation of a vaginal opening, with the hairy instinctual animal trying to enter and her holding him off. Now, here's another one. Another non-sexual image that has to do with sexual relating, and in this case, a series of dreams that involved forklifts. So a male patient came to therapy with a female therapist because of a problem with an addiction to internet pornography. But as their relationship developed and as he felt more comfortable, he started to reveal that he felt a great deal of pain and anger that his wife had left him for another man. And he also, since they were looking at dreams, reported several dreams in which forklifts featured prominently. Now, since the man worked in a construction-related field, this wasn't initially particularly striking. It was only later in the therapy that he revealed that his specific pornographic preference was for images of two men and one woman, two male prongs, like a forklift. And this, of course, raised other more poignant questions. Did he feel that women were so demanding that it took two men to satisfy them? Did it refer to the fact that his wife had been unfaithful, had had two men? At any rate, the repeated image of a doubly phallic forklift suddenly made sense when his sexual fantasy and his sexual history were revealed. Now, that's sort of interpreting from non-sexual images towards sex. But there's also interpreting away from sex. The broad Jungian view on dreams ascribes unconscious meaning to sexual dreams at many different levels, using it to represent both inner and outer relationships. And this is why we can't always take overtly erotic dreams at face value and just interpret them as straightforward, frustrated sexual wishes. We also have to think about whether we need to interpret away from sex and towards relationship. Sex appears in dreams as an organizer of imagery for good reasons. The interpenetration of bodies and desires is very good for representing longings, conflicts, and negotiations in inner and outer relationships. And sexual experience also involves these powerful surges of sensation and emotion that echo the dynamics of conflict and other complex relational feelings. And given this, it's not so surprising that the unconscious uses sexual metaphor as a bridge to emotional understanding of outer relationships as well. Outside of therapy, in real world sexual experiences, some people who struggle with emotional relating also try to use real sex, as a bridge. Anybody here who's a couple therapist is familiar with wives who complain that they can't feel sexual desire without emotional intimacy, and their husbands who say they can't feel emotionally intimate without a sexual connection, and how they are just, they're each blocking each other. A more subtle example might be of a patient who observed that it seemed that her father's only way of relating to any female person was by being sexually flirtatious, as if they were a girlfriend, and how uncomfortable this felt to her and how inappropriate when when it was directed at her when she was a teenager. And sometimes people have troubling sexual dreams about content that seems to contradict their conscious thoughts and feelings. They may dream upsettingly of pleasurable sex with an inappropriate person, somebody that's too old, too young, in a taboo relationship, like with a parent, child, sibling, priest, or their therapist. And, it can go further than that. We dream of acts that we would literally never dream of doing in real life. And in those cases, from a final perspective, it might be important to ask why? Why are we having this dream? And what is the unconscious trying to get across to us, when it faces us with fantasies and dreams about things that we find entirely inappropriate? For example, Jung, but there are reasons for this. Jung, when he was writing about sexual dreams that therapists had about patients, a taboo relationship these days, he suggested that they were an unconscious attempt to make a connection with a patient who was hard to connect with emotionally. The unconscious may also use sex and dreams to turn inwards and metaphorically express the relationship between the conscious personality and its unconscious inner parts, such as the shadow, the anima, or the animus. So, a man who dreams of having an exotic erotic encounter with a mysterious woman might be engaging with his anima, and similarly, a woman's erotic dream of a powerful, self assured lover might represent her animus and reflect unlived qualities like assertiveness or rationality. And when we allow ourselves to explore these disturbing and confusing dreams, we may get better at recognizing qualities that we've been projecting onto others instead of seeing them as our own. And it's well known that this sort of shadow and animus work may feel very uncomfortable because it really challenges our conscious sense of ourself, but it can also lead to experiences that are new and creative. We may also have sexual dreams that describe emotional and spiritual connections. Jung explored the sexual slash emotional slash spiritual experience in his studies on alchemy, particularly when he looked at the text called the Rosarium Philosophorum, where a central theme is the evolving relationship between male and female energies. And this union is pictured as the alchemical marriage between the king and the queen. And it culminates in the melting together of the male and female body and spirit to produce the mystical child called conjunctio. Here's the conjunctio over here. And this gets represented by modern dreamers as well. One woman, rather embarrassed, reported that at the end of a dream in which she and her female analyst had had a series of dangerous adventures together, her analyst lay beside her and caressed her tenderly, and their two bodies melted blissfully into each other as they floated upwards. And this may suggest that the woman felt a good and tender conjunctio with her therapist. Alternatively, one might wonder if she was relationally melting into her therapist as an act of over-identification. Understanding the implications of such a dream would take time and probably a lot of hard associational work. But to bring this together more simply, dreams can link one domain of experience to another using sexual imagery as a bridge, connecting relational issues with sexual ones and vice versa. Sexual images can be metaphors for interpersonal relating, as in the conjunctio example, or can use non-sexual images to describe sexual difficulties, as in the forklift example. Overtly sexual images can also, in dreams, can also translate into complex relational scenarios. Here's another example. A gay man dreamed of watching a man and a woman make love. The man caressed the woman, who also had a penis, tenderly, and both reached orgasm. In the dream, the male patient was very excited watching this, and when the couple finished, he leapt on the woman and thrust vigorously, but could not bring either himself or her to orgasm. Now, this dream was part of a longer series of dreams that he'd been working on with his Jungian analyst, in which he was trying to develop his relationship to his anima and his creativity. But when he discussed the dream with his therapist, he realized how beautifully it represented his feeling that his therapist had a much more satisfying relationship with his anima than he did himself, because they were willing to take time to develop and reflect on his inner world and relate to them intimately, more intimately than he did, because he was always trying to jump ahead and force things along too quickly. Disturbing sexual images, such as rape or the threat of rape, are common nightmares for both sexes. And while it's represented as a sexual interaction, rape is also a psychological invasion. So here's a dream that intersected sexual and safety fears. A young woman dreamed she heard a rapist enter her home. She and her sister fled and hid in the barn, but she saw the rapist had taken their two cats. She rushed out, successfully wrestling them away, and then lying on the ground, still holding her pets, she felt hampered in defending herself, but she'd had karate training and she assumed the proper stance for fighting on the ground. So while this dream contains an implied sexual threat to herself and her sister from a rapist, the young woman shows courage and assertiveness and feels she has the skills to defend herself. And when she associated to the dream, it turns out that it had come the night before she was going to present a project to a committee that she was afraid might attack and reject it. So here, the threatened attack was not to her body, but to her, her creative expression, her pet ideas. So far, we've been talking about adults with sexual dreams, but what about children? those of you who work with children practically or therapeutically or have raised children yourselves may also be aware of Freud's observations that some sort of sexuality in children often appears early. There's the Oedipus complex, I'm going to marry mommy, or the Electra complex, being daddy's girl, or maybe you've noticed that some kids discover masturbation very early. I can remember being about 22 and I had a slightly older friend who'd already had a child, and I can remember being at the supper table with them and her warning her 2-year-old son that he wasn't allowed to play with himself at the dinner table, and the little guy had an erection. I had never encountered that before. But it turns out that sexual feelings are present almost from birth, and therapists who work with children may have noticed that sex can be represented in children's dreams as well, even if they don't really understand it. We can remember Jung's dream of the phallus on the throne. And this is because instinctual stuff and its archetypal imaging goes way deep in the human psyche. So here's a dream from a preteen girl that bridges between the sexual and the symbolic in a poetic way. And she said, I walked down to a small beach between two cliff-like points of land. 4 short, hairy men are circling and pounding rhythmically on a large blue stone. I'm standing in a tide pool. The water rises and lifts me to the top of the ridge. I swim across it, and the water lowers me again on the other side. I have to wait until the water rises again to swim over the next ridge. Now, if you look at this from a Freudian causal perspective, that instinctual feelings are being represented in a disguised form, this dream can very easily be interpreted towards sex. The small beach between 2 cliff-like points of land and the tide pool can represent feminine or receptive spaces. The hairy men circling and pounding on a large blue stone could symbolize sexual activity, perhaps masturbation. The water rising and lifting, swimming across the ridge and being lowered again could be metaphors for sexual arousal, climax, the resolution of sexual tension, or the ridges might symbolize obstacles to achieving sexual satisfaction. But what if we look at it from the final perspective, assuming there's no disguise and that there's a psychological meaning, that the dream is highlighting something that the dreamer might not be consciously aware of? And then, like Jung, we have to ask, what is the purpose of this dream? What insight can it offer? So if we make a Jungian interpretation, the small beach is a dividing line between 2 elements, and it's tucked in between 2 points of land, so it could be a sheltered transitional space or a threshold, something marking the beginning of an awareness of boundaries or obstacles to entering a new life phase. The 4 hairy men circling and pounding on the blue stone, yes, could represent energies being processed, organized, and unconsciously integrated into a developing personality, including sexual energies. In Jungian terms, water often symbolizes the unconscious emotion or the flow of life. So the rising water lifting her suggests that the dreamer is being carried by natural unconscious processes towards higher levels of understanding and experience, and being carried in an organic, trustful way rather than an effortful one. She doesn't have to struggle to climb the cliffs to get over to the other side. Now, any and all of these interpretations might be relevant. How would we know which? Well, remember that Jung believed that it was through the patient's associations, that their unconscious would lead in a helpful way. And here, unfortunately, I have to disappoint you, because both those sets of interpretations were exactly what Jung was trying to avoid. Unfortunately, they came out of the psychologist's mind, not the dreamers, because the dream was collected a long time ago, and at the time, the girls' associations weren't asked about. But aligning with Jung's point that the dreamer's personal associations determine the meaning, knowing that it was dreamed by a 10-year-old girl the night before she got her period for the first time makes the rhythmic and the tidal elements very poignant, don't you think? Now, to pull on a thread that I dangled earlier, remember that one of the reasons Freud and Jung fell out was because Jung put more emphasis on the spiritual, while Freud was trying to make a science of psychoanalysis by lining it up with evolution and instincts. But another reason why sexual dreams are so important to consider is because of how spirituality and sexuality intertwine and are in tension with one another in the unconscious. Later in life, Jung wrote, in ancient times, the feeling of being penetrated by or receiving the god was allegorized by the sexual act, but it would be a gross misunderstanding to interpret a genuine religious experience as a repressed sexual fantasy on account of a mere metaphor. The penetration can also be expressed by a sword, spear, or arrow. And he could have been talking about this image, a sculpture of Saint Teresa of Avila, a Carmelite nun from the 1500s, who was depicted by Bernini as she was having a revelatory mystical experience where an angel pierced her heart with a golden spear, causing pain that was exquisitely sweet and left her feeling full of the divine love of God. And she described it in her journal as both spiritual and physical. Now, modern people look at this statue and they see the expression here as orgasmic. But the Catholic Church decided to define it as spiritual rapture instead. But I leave you to make up your own minds. But I think that this image beautifully captures the sense that sexuality and spirituality can have the same potency, and we lose a great deal if we ignore the spiritual potential of sexual experience. While we don't always treat it as sacred, sexuality has the potential to be the ultimate human relational act, the act that bonds two bodies and two psyches and creates the next generation of bodies, minds, and spirits. So we're going to take a little break here for about 5 minutes. And when we come back, I'm going to talk some more about things that we can learn from sexual dreams in a slightly more practical way. And I'm going to bring us around to the way that sexual dreams can contribute to our individuation process. When I was thinking about the ways in which the idea of sexual experience might be represented in dreams, I played with these ideas in a more abstract way, and I made this graphic. Since sex involves an interpenetration of bodies and, hopefully a mutuality of desires, as well as contact with the physical body and its openings, sexual dreams and sexual images have the ability to represent assertions, longings, conflicts, and negotiations between ourselves and others. The powerful surges of sexual experience can express dynamics of conflict and other intense feelings. So, this diagram I made suggests directions in which sexual images might be interpreted. And it's easy to imagine how any of these could be represented in sexual dreams. And I'm sure that you could think of more. So, if you start with the idea of sexual penetration, on the negative side, this could be an invasion. It could be insisting, demanding to have things your own way, needing to break into things. If you make it a bit more positive, it can be about asserting yourself, showing curiosity, creation, making effort, being an active agent in the world. If you go much more to the gestational, you have ejaculation, fertilizing others, being able to support and nourish others with your efforts and strengths. We also have, in this area, we have the primitive magic and the maternal breast, because this is the nipple and this is the mouth of the baby as well, right? And it could be breaking through barriers, like penetrating the hymen. And on the side of being penetrated, well, it could be experienced negatively as being invaded, being forced to accept things, even as far as being raped. Or it could be a lack or a void or a space that needs to be filled, being hungry for something, like the baby again with the nipple. It could be about accepting, responding, letting things in, letting ideas in, letting people in. Or it could be about containing, about being pregnant, being able to surround and embrace something, having a space to gestate a process or a project. And then, you know, there's the dynamics of the interaction. Is the situation moving or still? Is one person or the other active or passive? Is there a danger of getting stuck or getting out of control? And these, these situations could symbolize aspects of experience that touch all domains of human life: love, work, spiritual life, education. Um, And as I said, I think that probably one could think of many more. I'm wondering if we want to take a minute now to see if any of you have any other sort of interpretations to suggest. Okay, so now let me just make a little bit of a review and give you an overview again before I talk about sexual dreams and individuation. Looking at overtly sexual dreams, or dreams that reflect sexual experiences and attitudes in a non-sexual language, can offer us various types of insight. Just to go back over what Jung was talking about, the intentions of dreams, the fourfold intentions of dreams. Sexual dreams can fill all four functions. They can compensate the position or the attitude of consciousness. Jung's illustration of the young man who dreamed of stealing apples is a good example of this, how he needed to shift his consciousness away from what everyone is doing and focus on his own ethical standards. And here, in this context, let me remind you that sin actually comes in two varieties that our unconscious can react to: commission and omission. Sins of commission are the overt bad deeds and failures that we may be ashamed of or guilty about, but our unconscious is also sensitive to sins of omission, and it's going to react when we don't live up to our own values or respect our own deeper principles. The second use of the or second intention of dreams is to reveal the actual situation of the unconscious at the time. And here we can think of the gay man who realized that he was meeting his anima in dreams, but he wasn't relating to her in a healthy way because he was always trying to hurry things along in his psyche. Dreams carry a message from the unconscious to consciousness. A sexual dream might be hinting at a red flag, or it might be offering a green light. It might be saying something about the character of the person that you're in a relationship with. Are they seen by your unconscious as a magician, a wild woman, a guru, or an instinctual animal, like the young woman in the laundromat who had to become conscious of her discomfort at her date's sexual enthusiasm? Now, I tried to describe in my graphic some of the ways that sexual images can represent our current situations and problems, things like power relationships, closeness, distance, fears of abandonment. But sexual passion is a metaphor for any other sort of passion as well. We can think of the dream of the young woman who had a vocational calling to become a pastor and how her unconscious translated the training program into a symbolic gestation. Or we can think about St. Teresa's spiritual ecstasy. We have love affairs with attitudes and ideals as well. And like the woman who adopted the proper fighting stance towards the rapist, uh, the next day she was able to defend her pet ideas from the threatening committee. And then finally, the fourth um, function of dreams is to personify the psychological complexes that are active at the time so that we can meet and exchange with them. And Carl Jung's own Red Book encounters with Philemon and Salome are the famous example of this. Jung pointed out that relating to our unconscious isn't just an intellectual process. He thought about how the unconscious communicates with us indirectly in many ways, as he said, through fascinations, fantasies, symbolic actions, slips of the tongue, and importantly, in dreams, including sexual dreams. And interestingly, sexual dream imagery often occurs at times where there is potential for change or a new life avenue to explore, like the young girl's beach dream. Unconscious compensation is a crucial idea in the final perspective and also in the individuation process. Our unconscious is always working towards a better integration of our physical, psychological, and spiritual needs because disregarding psychological issues can lead to harm for the individual in the same way that a one-sided diet can harm the body. But to go a bit deeper in a Jungian way about the idea of the psychic course corrections that can be offered by dreams, I want to say a few words about the role of sexual dreams in the process of individuation specifically. So, just to do a very quick overview for those of you who aren't familiar, so familiar with Jungian concepts, the process of individuation is the way we systematically and progressively come to terms with our inner world and the powers of the unconscious. We don't just leap into relationship with the unconscious in one go. Think of the example of the man I gave who got too eager in his dream and tried to jump onto his anima without engaging her respectfully first. The individuation process involves encounters with the unconscious at different and ever deepening levels. Generally, first we encounter and we assimilate our shadow aspects. We get to know our contrasexual parts, our anima and our animus, and then, deeper still, we may have numinous or humbling interactions with archetypal characters or experiences with the collective unconscious, like Jung had, again, in his Red Book fantasies. Working with our sexual dreams can lead us to a better understanding of the unconscious forces that are active inside all of us. And as we work towards a more integrated self understanding, hopefully our egos will also recognize healthy limits and will learn how to appreciate the guiding power of the psyche in ways that heal and enrich us. Here we think of Jung's respect for his patient's associations in interpreting dreams and his confidence that the unconscious could show the way. Dream interpretation has a very important role in connecting us to our inner world, and it's not hard to see how sexual dreams can play a role in individuation because they give us access and material for reflection at many different levels. But just let me wind this up now. Both Jung and Freud believed that the best understanding of dream content came through the association process, and that it was our associations that would guide us to an understanding of the point that the dream was trying to make. And when we spend time with them, our sexual dreams can surprise us. They can broaden our understanding by illustrating and calling attention to our less known expectations, emotions, or our natural needs, including sexual needs that we might be neglecting. Or they may be metaphors for how we're responding in a relational or a spiritual situation. A Jungian perspective on sexual dreams doesn't dismiss them as just uh, an instinctual drive, but treats them respectfully as carriers of unconscious information. Meeting our dreams with our sexual dreams with respect and curiosity extends their value beyond a mere random firing of neurons or an undigested bit of cheese or an instinctual release. And it makes them something meaningful to be explored rather than something shameful to be hidden or to be put out of mind. Thank you.